All right, guys.
Welcome back, government. Good to see you again, government. Yesterday we talked a lot about the Fed, and we talked about that on Monday as well. Thanks for bearing with me. I know that is not the most exciting thing in the world, and if you've come to expect one thing out of my class, it's nonstop excitement. So today um, we're still talking about the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, but we're gonna look at some of the other positions, some of the other secretaries, basically. And these are not secretaries like we think of in regular day life, where it's the man or woman who makes your copies and answers the phone call. These are guys and women who have very important roles in the way that our government runs. So technically, the entire federal bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. And at the top of this organizational pyramid is the president. The president is served directly by the White House staff, and that's made up of trusted policy and political advisors. We call them special assistants. The public spokesperson for the president is the press secretary. The We just got a new secretary. I apologize. I'll look up her name, but the previous one, in her entire tenure as secretary, she didn't hold a single press briefing, which, to my knowledge, is the first and only time that's ever happened in the history of the office of the presidency. So, the executive office of the president is staffed by various advisors and policy experts, and they're selected by the president and his office rather than rising through the ranks of government employment, or they're chosen for political reasons, like a lot of cabinet secretaries. The offices in the executive office of the president give important advice to the president on specific topics. So, although there are a lot of different departments in the EOP, probably the most important are the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget goes by OMB. There's an acronym or an initials for everything in the government. Um, so one of the oldest functioning government agency is the Postal Service. Now it's a government corporation. It started out as an agency. Now it's a corporation. And what that means is the Postal Service and Amtrak are the only two departments or agencies of the United States government that are designed to make a profit. And neither of them has been thriving as of late. And a lot of people are suggesting that we actually abolish the Postal Service and rely solely on private mail carriers, which that would come with a lot of implications that would affect you and me as we try to send mail. I know that snail mail, as they call it, is becoming increasingly rare, but that would be a major shift for the U.S. to get rid of the Postal Service, one of the oldest agencies. Again, now more of a corporation, but still one of the initial, one of the original agencies. I'd say one of the best known government agencies, independent agencies, is probably NASA. NASA is one of the best known independent agencies because what they do, at least what they do publicly, facing the public, is really glamorous. It's adventurous and it's glamorous. It's cool to go up to space. So these agencies of the executive branch, they're the tools of government, and they have to make as the government makes policy and tries to implement it. Just a second, guys. Got an important school message. Okay, guys, sorry for the delay. Where were we? Yeah, I think we were just talking about those agencies of the executive branch and how we're going to call them tools that the government has. Tools that the government has to not only make policy, but to implement it. When we say implement, that means pretty much to put into place. So there are three main strategies that the government has at its disposal. Um, Number one is party leadership. President's the leader of his political party, and he can use that leadership to create and manage policy, especially in Congress, where party matters a lot. In other words, congressional decisions tend to align with the mentality or political philosophy of whatever political party that person, that congressman or woman is a member of. And that makes sense. But the idea is that uh, Congress, even more so than other agencies, than other politicians, often make decisions on party lines. In fact, a lot of times it seems as if that's their sole motivation is to perpetuate the party line. So party affiliation doesn't much matter to an agency head because he's not running for office. So members of the party are head agencies, and those heads, once they're appointed, they really don't have to pay a lot of attention to party affiliation. Again, because they're not running for office. So control of the party makes it easier for the president to get choices through Congress. We've talked about that, especially when the president and the majorities in Congress are of the same political party. So that strategy doesn't work when there's divided government. But when one party controls both chambers of Congress and the White House, it's easier for the president to use his position as party leader as leverage to accomplish his policy goals. Another strategy of the three main strategies. So we had A, party leadership, B, mobilizing public opinion. Mobilizing public opinion, it's also not the most important tool in the president's toolbox, but the president's access to the media is almost limitless. If he wants a press conference or a speech on national TV, he gets it. This use of media is sometimes called the bully pulpit. It sounds like a big policy stick, but it has a downside. Basically, it's not really going to work if the president isn't popular, and his approval ratings almost always decline the longer he's in office. That's just a general statement, um, not necessarily applying to one president. Now, currently, and we haven't gotten to talk much about current events lately, which I really hate. I was enjoying talking to you guys about the primaries and the upcoming election, etc. But there is a major criticism right now of the major news networks because the president has been conducting what he's calling briefings on the coronavirus. His critics on the left are arguing that essentially the networks that are airing those briefings are allowing him to make campaign speeches. In other words, the criticism is that he's not actually delivering useful information regarding the virus, that he's more or less taking advantage of the bully pulpit or this free media as a way to campaign for 2020. So you can make up your mind about that, but that's a major point of contention right now between people on the left and moderates and the Republicans and the news networks that are carrying them. A couple of the networks, CNN for one, has stopped airing them or will cut away from them before he's finished speaking. CNN often draws the ire or often gets criticized by folks on the right. So I'm sure they would point to that as yet another illustration of mainstream media bias. But again, it's just a messy situation, and it's all very complicated. And yet, it's super simple. How's that for a statement that doesn't really make sense? But it's true. And the third is administrative strategies. That's the most important strategy. So we had party leadership, mobilizing public opinion, and administrative strategies, which is the most important, I believe. Using administrative agencies to make and carry out policies is important if you're the president. There are a number of different ways that the president can use his administrative offices to bring about the objectives he wants. So over time, the president has expanded the size and capacities of the executive office of the president, especially since the New Deal. We really haven't spoken about the New Deal in this class because, as much as I like to incorporate history, it's not technically a history class, but the New Deal was the most massive, comprehensive expansion of government programs in American history. It was a policy or a system implemented by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as a way to try to get us out of the Great Depression. So really, that was an era where there were huge additions to this federal bureaucracy. So the enlarged executive office of the presidency, it gathers information about policies, plans, programs, communicates with constituents, including Congress and interest groups, and it can supervise other agencies and check on how they're doing. One of the most important examples of this is the expanded reach of the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget gets to plan the budget, and it exercises huge influence over how government money is spent. Another administrative strategy that the president can use is called regulatory review. Federal agencies are usually required to make rules for how they operate. The president's office can review these rules, make suggestions, or even order agencies to adopt certain rules. That can have enormous direct and indirect influence over how the rule is implemented. So the most important administrative strategy, we've already said that using administrative agencies or administrative strategies were the most important in terms of what specific administrative strategy that the president has at his disposal. The executive order is the most important. So what does that mean? What is an executive order? Well, executive orders are presidential directives that have the force of law, and presidents have used them for major policies that would have been very difficult to get through Congress. So when I say that executive action has been used to push through major policies, I mean major policies, giant policies like purchasing Louisiana, annexing Texas, emancipating the slaves, interning Japanese Americans during World War II, creating the Peace Corps, and implement affirmative action. Let's go through those again. Purchasing Louisiana, or the Louisiana Purchase, which was actually much, much bigger than the state of Louisiana. Annexing Texas, so basically making Texas a state. Freeing the slaves, interning Japanese Americans during World War II. Again, these are things that you guys will talk about when you're seniors in U.S. history, but interning Japanese Americans. Interning is a nice way of saying rounded up and put into non-deadly camps. So these weren't concentration camps. But anyways, my point in including that is that these executive orders can be very large and very significant. So the arguments in favor of an expanded presidency of this large bureaucracy are, well, first of all, in emergencies, the nation needs a leader who can act fast, and the president is presumably or ideally best suited to be that leader. The thing is, this could give him an incentive to create emergencies and further increase his power, but we will try not to get cynical about that. The second argument holds that the president is more able to act in the public interest because he's the center of public attention. And thus, he's easily held accountable. Now, I would argue that accountability over the last 2 years has been minimal, but that is, well, excuse me, not 2 years, 3 years, but that's just my personal opinion. And you're, of course, as always, free to disagree. And the third argument in favor of a powerful president is that he's the only nationally elected official. And thus, he's the most democratic one. Again, these are all things that we would like to be true, and we would like to think are true. So, kind of moving on, and we'll try to go through this quickly, so then we can get into the cabinet. But if we don't get into the cabinet today, that's fine too. So, continuing with bureaucracy. Americans tend to associate bureaucracies with these incomprehensible rule and time-wasting procedures that are very annoying. But bureaucracies are a lot like our extended families in that we largely don't understand or at least appreciate the important role that bureaucracies play in our lives, mainly because of all the forms. So what is the political science definition of bureaucracy? A bureaucracy is a complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, and principles of organization that are employed by large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel. So bureaucracy or bureaucrat, those terms are not used exclusively when talking about politics. We just happen to be talking about the federal bureaucracy. Another point that is important to emphasize is bureaucracies are made up of experts who usually know more about the topic at hand than you do, and who are able to divide up tasks or delegate so they can get done. Now, I can't say it enough. These are all ideal situations, but there are cases like our current Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is a former brain surgeon who essentially knows nothing about it. Our Secretary of Education is a woman who attended private schools and has essentially no history or no experience in education. Now, some would argue that outside perspective is a good thing. I do know that Secretary DeVos, the Education Secretary, is a strong advocate for charter schools. So I suppose she would support what we're doing here at Savannah Classical Academy. Second, thing that it's important to emphasize is that all large scale institutions use bureaucracy. So the distinction between big business and big government, in at least this respect, is bogus. If you want to use a really fancy word, you'll call it a false dichotomy. The distinction between business and big government, big business and big government, is phony, or you could call it a false dichotomy. So the main reason, despite, we've talked about positives and we've talked about negatives, the main reason that we have bureaucracy, in America is that they're efficient, or again, ideally, they're efficient. They're supposed to make it easier for governments to accomplish tasks quickly and to basically operate at all. So, some of the specific functions federal bureaucrats have, they implement the laws that Congress writes. Like, if you've ever tried to read a law, they're pretty complicated. So it's a good idea to have experts who can interpret them and put them into action. Two, bureaucrats make and enforce their own rules. Three, they settle disputes through a process that we call administrative adjudication. So that makes them sort of like a court in certain circumstances. So technically, we're using the word federal, of course. So the federal bureaucracy, it's technically part of the executive branch, but it's so big that it dwarfs the other two branches and it can easily overpower them. In other words, legislative, judicial, executive are supposed to be separate but equal. We talked about that probably the first or second week of, probably like the first or second day of school. But the bureaucracy, which operates under the umbrella of the executive branch, it's so huge that it really gives somewhat of an unfair advantage in certain situations. So they don't just enforce the rules, they make new ones. And they call those regulations. And doing this, they're acting like a legislature, especially since the rules have the force of law and people can be punished for breaking them. So in a way, federal rulemaking is more democratic than congressional lawmaking, but it's still not in the Constitution. The first reason that we keep bureaucracies is they can be useful. They do get things done when they're operating like they're supposed to. And that's a big qualifier, guys. When I say something like when they're operating as they're supposed to, uh, that is not necessarily always the case that they are. And some of these things are things we want done, like inspecting our meat so we don't get disease, that kind of thing. Now, the main argument for privatization seems to be the cost. So the bureaucracies do provide a certain amount of stability. And ideally, you would want some level of expertise to come with it. But that's not always the case. There are different types of bureaucracies. There are cabinet level agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations. So, as far as the cabinet level agencies, and we finally made it, talked about the cabinet. The first type of bureaucracy is this cabinet level, also called the executive department. So, each of the 15 departments is usually headed by a secretary, except the Justice Department. The Justice Department is run by who? You guessed it, Attorney General. The ones you hear most about are the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Treasury Department. Other departments like Interior, Housing and Urban Development, you usually only hear about when there's a new secretary or when there's a scandal. Executive departments mostly provide services through sub-agencies. So, for example, the FBI is technically out of the Department of Justice, and the Food and Drug Administration is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So there are also independent agencies that are very similar to executive departments because their heads require Senate confirmation. The best example of that would probably be the CIA or NASA. We also get the second type of bureaucracy, independent regulatory commissions. And we're going to talk about them very quickly, and then we'll talk about government corporations, and then we're going to stop for the day. We didn't get deep into the cabinet, but that's okay. We have plenty of time to talk about that tomorrow. So an independent regulatory commission, those are supposed to be even further removed from the presidential oversight. And that's what makes them independent. You can recognize them because they're usually called commissions, like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They all have rulemaking authority and the power to punish violations of the rules, often through fines. It can be other punishments as well, but a lot of times it's through issuing fines. And then thirdly, government corporations. We mentioned these earlier, but government corporations are supposed to make profits, but in fact tend to rely on government subsidies to stay afloat. So a subsidy is for our purposes, we'll simplify it. It's the government providing financial assistance. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's an okay definition for us. So the U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak, like I said, they're the best known. And for most Americans, those are the agencies that we have the most contact with, especially the post office. I would love to be in class and ask you guys to raise your hand if you've ever been on a train, like an Amtrak train. That's becoming less and less common, but for a time it was a viable way of traveling. And I suppose depending on where you're going and where you're leaving from, it might still be. Okay, I could talk about trains all day, but I'm not going to. I'm actually glad we were able to talk quite a bit about things without even getting into his actual cabinet. So we're going to talk about the cabinet tomorrow. Let's check out your classwork and see what we got going on in class. U.S. history, we don't want you. There we go. Classwork. Now, guys, remember there was an assignment in there last week that did not have a due date on it. I added a due date on Sunday night. I added a due date for tomorrow. So you have an assignment due tomorrow. Although, let me check that and make sure I'm right. We'll check that out. So I'm going to post this lesson right here under week 3, day 2 lesson. I won't give you a summary assignment. So I'll go ahead and just delete this. And instead of that, I'll just provide some links for additional resources. I do love a crash course. So, all right, guys, with that, I'm going to stop and I will see you tomorrow.